When everyone noticed me, I sent him over $500,000 just because he called me beautiful and say romantic words to me. I was 23 when I first learned that beauty could be a kind of power. I didn't think of it that way back then. I only knew that when I walked into a room, people looked up, their eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Women smiled at me with something between admiration and comparison. Men straightened their shoulders, cleared their throats, suddenly aware of themselves. I didn't wake up every morning thinking I'm beautiful, but the world told me so often that eventually I believed it. The grocery store was my first mirror. Cashiers commented on my smile. Strangers asked what shampoo I used, how I kept my skin so clear. At church, older women squeezed my arm and said, "You'll break hearts, dear," like it was a blessing. I learned to laugh it off, but inside something warmed and settled. I mattered, I was seen, and then there was him. When I met my husband, it felt like destiny dressed in Sunday clothes. He was handsome in a way that didn't need explanation, strong jaw, kind eyes, the kind of man mothers trusted and daughters admired. When we stood side by side, people noticed us together. That was the thing. We didn't just shine individually, we reflected each other. I loved the way his hand fit at the small of my back like it belonged there. I loved how he introduced me proud, deliberate. "This is my wife," not "this is her name." My wife, as if saying it out loud reminded him how lucky he was. We were admired, and I drank it in without shame. I loved being told I was beautiful. I loved hearing it whispered in the dark and said casually over breakfast. I loved that he couldn't pass me in the hallway without touching me, couldn't sit beside me without pulling me closer. Some people say beauty fades. What they don't tell you is that when you grow up being praised for it, don't just lose compliments. When it fades, you lose a language, a way the world speaks to you. Back then, though, I thought praise was permanent. I thought love stayed loud forever. Our wedding day is still sharp in my mind. The way people sighed when I walked down the aisle, the way my husband looked at me like I was something precious he'd been trusted with. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how life will always feel. I didn't know time was listening. In my 20s, everything felt abundant: love, desire, attention, laughter. I didn't know to be afraid of silence yet. I didn't know that one day I would miss the sound of someone telling me I was beautiful more than I missed youth itself. All I knew then was this: I was seen, I was wanted, and I never wanted that feeling to stop. The perfect match people used to say we looked like we belonged together. Before they even knew our names, at dinners, strangers would assume we were newlyweds, even months, sometimes years after the wedding. "You can tell," they'd say with a knowing smile, "the way you look at each other." I always felt a small thrill hearing that, like I had passed some invisible test. He courted me gently but confidently. There was no chasing, no uncertainty. He called when he said he would. He opened doors, pulled out chairs, placed his hand at my waist as if to quietly claim me without ever needing to announce it. When he complimented me, it wasn't just about my looks, though he never failed to mention those. It was about how I made him feel proud, how he liked being seen with me, how I elevated his life just by being in it. That mattered to me more than I ever admitted. We built our marriage quickly, eagerly, like two people who believed love was an endless resource. Our first home was small, but it felt grand because we filled it with affection. We laughed loudly, touched often, argued rarely. When we disagreed, we made up in ways that left us breathless and closer than before. He admired me openly, in front of friends, in front of family. He told people I was beautiful without being prompted, without embarrassment. I didn't have to fish for it. The praise came freely, like air, and I breathed it in without guilt. At night, he traced my face as if memorizing it. "I don't ever want to forget this," he'd say. I believed him. I believed memory was stronger than time. We were young, but we felt permanent. There's a particular confidence that comes from being chosen so completely. I walked taller. I laughed more easily. I felt safe, not just emotionally, but physically, desired, anchored, like I belonged exactly where I was. Friends would tell me how lucky I was, and I would nod, but inside I thought, this is just how marriage is supposed to be. I didn't know then that what we had was something people lose without realizing it as slipping through their fingers. Looking back, I see how perfect it all seemed. Not flawless, but glowing. We were admired because we admired each other, because we looked like a promise that worked. And in those early years, it did. If someone had told me then that love could quiet itself without leaving entirely, that it could stay but stop speaking, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have laughed. I would have held his hand tighter and said, "Not us." At that stage of my life, forever felt simple. It felt like us. Love spoken daily in those early years. Love wasn't something we questioned. It was something we practiced daily, casually, without effort. He told me I was beautiful the way other people commented on the weather in passing without ceremony. "You look beautiful this morning," he'd say while pouring coffee, still half asleep, or he'd pause in the doorway as I brushed my hair and smile, like the sight of me had interrupted his thoughts. I don't know how I got so lucky. Those words settled into me. They became part of how I understood myself. Touch was constant then. Not always sexual, though often it was, but affectionate in a way that made me feel cherished. A hand on my lower back as we crossed the street, fingers laced together while watching television. His palm resting on my thigh as if to remind me he was there, that I was his. I felt claimed but never confined. At night he held me like sleep itself depended on it. I loved the weight of his arm, the warmth of his body, the quiet certainty that came from being wanted without having to ask. Desire didn't need to be scheduled. It rose naturally, easily, like breath. We spoke about the future with confidence, children, vacations, growing old together. The idea of aging didn't scare me then because I assumed love aged like wine, deepening, becoming richer with time. No one tells you that sometimes it thins instead, slowly, until you barely recognize its taste. But back then love was loud. He praised me in private and in public, complimented my looks, my laugh, the way I moved through the world. He made me feel not just attractive, but valued, as if my presence mattered beyond utility, beyond roles. I think that's what I miss most now, not youth, not perfection, but the way affection once flowed without negotiation. I didn't know to store those moments away. I thought there would always be more. In my 20s, I believed love spoke forever. I didn't know it could one day fall silent without ever truly leaving the room. Becoming a mother, motherhood arrived in my life like a tide, strong, consuming, and impossible to resist. I was still in my 20s when I held my first daughter, her tiny body curled against my chest, her breath warm and uneven. I remember thinking that love had just expanded in a way I hadn't known was possible. It didn't replace what I felt for my husband, it multiplied it. We were no longer just a couple. We were a family in the making. My husband was wonderful then, attentive, proud. He stood beside me like a partner in every sense, waking in the night without complaint, rocking our daughter so I could rest, smiling at me with tired eyes that still held admiration. "You're incredible," he'd whisper, watching me soothe her. Even in exhaustion, I felt seen. When our second daughter came not long after, our home grew louder and fuller. Toys scattered across the floor, laundry piled endlessly, laughter echoing from room to room. We were young enough to handle it all with energy, but old enough to understand how precious it was. We raised our girls together, really together. School mornings, bedtime stories, scraped knees, proud moments at recitals and graduations. We showed them affection openly. They saw us kiss in the kitchen, tease each other, hold hands on walks. I wanted them to grow up knowing what love looked like. Motherhood changed my body, of course, softer in places, marked. But back then I didn't feel less beautiful. My husband still touched me with desire, still told me I was beautiful, sometimes even more so. You gave me this family, he'd say, as if that alone made me glow. I was busy, fulfilled, surrounded by purpose. I didn't notice time passing because every day felt necessary. My beauty wasn't just something admired, it felt useful, woven into nurturing, into being needed. Those years were loud with love, messy, exhausting, sacred. I didn't realize then that seasons change quietly, that one day the house would grow still, that the roles I poured myself into would slowly loosen their grip. At the time, I believed this fullness was permanent. I didn't know how much of myself I had tied to being needed or how empty it would feel when that need faded. Time at work time doesn't announce itself when it starts changing things. It works quietly, patiently, like something rearranging a room while you're asleep. You wake up one day and nothing feels wrong exactly, but nothing feels quite the same either. In my 30s and 40s, life stayed busy enough to distract me. The girls needed rides, help with homework, guidance through heartbreaks and dreams. My husband focused more on work, on providing, on being steady. I told myself that was love too, maybe a different kind, quieter, mature, but little things began to disappear. The compliments didn't stop all at once. They just came less often. Weeks would pass without him telling me I was beautiful, then months. When he did say it, it sounded automatic, like a line he knew he was supposed to deliver. Touch changed too. It became functional. A quick hug, a peck on the cheek, no lingering hands, no hunger. I noticed, but I didn't complain. I told myself this was normal, that passion naturally cooled, that wanting more was selfish. I watched my reflection longer than I used to, tilted my head, studied the lines forming around my mouth, the softening of my waist. I wasn't invisible yet, but I could feel myself moving toward the edge of attention, and that frightened me more than I expected. My husband still loved me. I knew that. He just didn't look at me the way he once had. And being loved without being desired is a strange, lonely thing. It leaves you doubting parts of yourself you once trusted completely. I tried to bridge the gap, new clothes, different hair, subtle attempts to catch his eye. Sometimes it worked, but only briefly, like striking a match in the wind. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of a long quiet. That time wasn't just changing our bodies, it was changing the language we used to love each other. Back then, I still believed I could outrun it. I didn't know time always wins. The praise fades by the time I reached my 50s. The silence had a shape. It wasn't loud enough to confront, not sharp enough to accuse, but it was there, sitting between us at the table, lying beside me in bed. I could feel it even when we were talking, especially then. The praise I once lived on had thinned to almost nothing, not because I had become unworthy of it, but because he no longer thought to offer it. If I dressed nicely, he didn't notice. If I wore makeup, he didn't ask why. I could walk past him in a room and feel like furniture, familiar, useful, unseen. I told myself not to be vain. Women my age weren't supposed to care so much about being admired. We were supposed to care about stability, about family, about gratitude. I scolded myself for wanting something so shallow, but it wasn't shallow, it was hunger. I didn't need strangers to look at me. I didn't need attention from the world. I needed it from the one person who had once made me feel irreplaceable. I needed to hear, "You're still beautiful to me." Instead, what I heard were reminders about appointments, about chores, about things undone. Love had turned managerial, efficient, quiet. When I brought it up carefully, gently, he seemed confused, defensive. "We're fine," he'd say. "We've been together this long, haven't we?" As if longevity itself were proof of affection. I began to mourn something I couldn't name out loud. My body had changed, yes, but not into something unlovable. I still felt desire, still wanted touch, still wanted to feel like a woman, not just a wife, not just a mother whose job was nearly done. But desire, when it has nowhere to go, becomes pain. I stopped trying after a while. Rejection, even when it's subtle, teaches you to retreat. So I learned to be quiet, to fold my longing inward, to tell myself this was the cost of time. What I didn't know then was that unmet longing doesn't disappear. It waits, living like roommates. Somewhere along the way, our marriage became practical. We shared a roof, shared expenses, shared history, but not ourselves. Our days followed predictable paths, morning coffee in silence, separate routines, evenings spent in the same room, doing different things. He watched television, I read or scrolled or simply stared at nothing in particular. We spoke politely, kindly even, but there was no spark in our voices, no warmth underneath the words. We coordinated rather than connected. If someone had watched us from the outside, they might have thought we were comfortable. And maybe we were if comfort means untouched corners and carefully avoided truths. At night, we slept in the same bed, but it felt like sharing space on opposite shores. His back turned, my hands folded to myself. I learned the sound of his breathing, steady and distant, and wondered when I had stopped being someone he reached for in his sleep. I missed small things the most, the casual touch, the way he used to pull me close without thinking. Now, if our arms brushed, it felt accidental, almost awkward, as if our bodies no longer remembered each other. I didn't hate him. That was the confusing part. There was no anger, no betrayal, no Great Wound 2.2, just absence. A slow draining of intimacy until all that remained was habit. Friends would talk about their marriages, complain about their husbands, laugh about old arguments. I smiled along, never admitting that my problem wasn't conflict, it was emptiness. You can't argue with someone who isn't really there with you. I wondered sometimes if this was simply the natural end of romance, if love, like youth, had an expiration date no one warned you about, if this quiet companionship was all that remained after decades together. I wanted to be more than someone who shared a last name and a bed. I wanted to be a woman again, desired, touched, chosen not out of duty but out of want. And that want, unspoken and unmet, began to feel like a secret life I carried alone. Starved for touch, it's strange how the body remembers what the heart is trying to forget. I told myself for years that I was past wanting, past needing touch the way I once had. I said it out loud sometimes, half as a joke, half as a defense. Those days are behind me, but my body never agreed. It still responded to warmth, to closeness, to the simple act of being held. My husband touched me 2 or 3 times a year, briefly, carefully, as if intimacy were something fragile that might break him if he stayed too long. I tried to be grateful. I told myself that many women had less, but wanting to be touched 2 or 3 times a day and receiving it a few times a year creates a kind of ache that gratitude cannot fix. I felt embarrassed by my desire, ashamed even. Women my age weren't supposed to feel this way. We were supposed to be content, settled beyond all that. Yet I felt more alive in my wanting than I did in my restraint. Sometimes I would sit beside him on the couch and lean just slightly closer, hoping he might notice. He rarely did. Other times he noticed and gently shifted away, not unkindly, just tired. We never fought about it. That almost made it worse. There was nothing to resolve, nothing to fix, just two people living at different distances from the same need. Loneliness inside a marriage is its own kind of isolation. You can't explain it easily. People assume you're not alone because someone is there, but presence without connection only sharpens the absence. At night, I lay awake and remembered the woman I used to be, the one who was pulled close without asking, whose body was welcomed, not negotiated. I missed the reassurance that came with touch, the way it once told me I was still wanted in this world. I wasn't looking to leave. I wasn't looking to betray anyone. I was just starving. And starvation, when it lasts long enough, makes even crumbs feel like a feast. 20 years of silence, 20 years, 2 whole decades of quiet. At first, the emptiness was subtle, a missed compliment here, a brush of his hand there. I told myself life changed, that passion ebbed and flowed, that our love was deep in ways that didn't need words or touch. I believed it because what else could I believe? But time is patient and it waits for no one. Slowly, imperceptibly, the space between us widened. We shared meals, holidays, family celebrations, but never the thrill of being desired, never the excitement of being truly seen. My husband's presence became practical, mine too in response, a silent agreement to coexist rather than to connect. I tried to fill the gap with anything I could control. I immersed myself in my daughters, their achievements, their happiness. I threw myself into the house, decorating, organizing, making everything beautiful. It helped briefly, but it wasn't enough. My longing lurked beneath polished floors and folded laundry like a shadow no light could reach. I stopped asking, stopped hinting. The few times I tried, I was gently rebuffed or met with confusion. It was easier to fold my desires into myself, to pretend they weren't there, easier to speak in silence than risk the awkwardness of unreciprocated need. But the body remembers, the heart remembers. Even decades later, I would wake in the night and remember his hands on me in those early years, the warmth and certainty that had once been effortless, and I would ache. Loneliness over 20 years doesn't just stay lonely, it sharpens, it becomes a quiet, gnawing companion. It makes you desperate without ever speaking. It makes you wonder, even in your 70s, if the desire for touch, for validation, for being seen as a woman, not just a wife, not just a mother, is a sin. I hadn't been unfaithful. I hadn't even considered it, but the hunger. The hunger was a living thing inside me, patient, insistent, whispering reminders of the woman I used to be, the woman who was praised, desired, admired, the woman who felt alive. And by the time I reached my 70s, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. A friend requested came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually drifted by unnoticed. A friend request, a name I didn't recognize, a man, late 60s, polite message. Hello, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. You seem someone worth knowing. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My first instinct was caution. After all, I had never given another man a chance in my entire life. Not since the day I married, not once. My loyalty, my pride, my years of marital devotion all told me to ignore it. But there was something quiet about the message, a softness, a kindness that didn't demand. Something in his tone stirred a part of me I had long buried, curiosity, maybe loneliness. Definitely, I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart told me to walk away, my mind told me to protect myself, but my soul whispered, what if this is what you've been waiting for? So I accepted. The first messages were careful, polite. He asked about my day, my family, my thoughts. He didn't immediately flatter me, not at first. But then gradually the compliments came, not clumsy or shallow, thoughtful, specific. Gentle reminders that I was still beautiful, that I deserved to be loved and seen, not trapped in years of silence. I felt my pulse quicken reading each note. My hands trembled as I typed responses. It was exhilarating in a way I hadn't felt in decades, dangerous, yes, but intoxicating. For the first time in 20 years, I felt noticed. Truly noticed, not by a husband who had grown distant, not by children who loved me, but depended on me in ways that left no room for desire, but by someone who seemed to see me. I didn't know then that this curiosity would grow into obsession, that it would pull me into a place I could never have imagined. I only knew that for the first time in decades, I felt alive again, and I wanted more, words she had waited. For he was a rig engineer, he told me, working offshore on an oil contract. a world away, yet somehow close enough that his words wrapped around me like a warm scarf. He didn't just tell me I was beautiful. He reminded me every single day, little messages, notes that arrived like raindrops on a parched land. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be touched. You're not meant to live like a prisoner. I felt my chest lift with every message. Every compliment reminded me of what I had been starving for all these years. Every word became a heartbeat I could finally feel again. I started dressing differently, not for him, I told myself, at least not entirely. I put on makeup I hadn't touched in years. I carefully chose outfits that flattered my shape. I combed my hair with extra care, and then I would take a picture, send it to him, and wait for his reply. And he replied with admiration, with that kind of language I had longed to hear from my husband but never did. He noticed my eyes, the curve of my smile, the way my hair fell. He noticed me. It wasn't just the words, it was the attention, the consistency, the affirmation that my desire, my need to be seen and wanted, wasn't shameful, that it was alive, valid, powerful, even now in my 70s. For the first time in decades, I felt like a woman again, not just a wife, not just a mother, not just a body that time had softened, but a woman who was worthy of desire, of attention, of care, and it was intoxicating. So intoxicating that I didn't stop to ask myself if it was safe. I didn't pause to question if the attention could be real. I simply let it fill the empty spaces that had grown wider and colder with each passing year. For the first time in 20 years, I allowed myself to hope, becoming beautiful again. I didn't just feel alive, I started looking alive again. It began subtly, a little lipstick, a brush of blush, a scent I hadn't worn in years, but soon it became ritual. I found myself standing in front of the mirror longer than necessary, adjusting my hair, smoothing the lines that age had drawn on my face, choosing clothes that made me feel confident rather than just presentable. Every glance at myself felt like a rehearsal for his praise, and he noticed, "Your smile lights up the room," he would. Right? Even in a photo, I can feel your warmth. Look at you, still stunning. You deserve to be admired. I couldn't remember the last time someone spoke to me like that. Not my husband, not anyone. I had spent decades fading quietly into the background, invisible except for the roles I played, mother, wife, homemaker, and now suddenly I mattered again. I felt a thrill each time I took a photo for him. I posed differently, held myself taller, smiled wider, and waited. The messages came back immediately, full of warmth and desire. My pulse would race, my cheeks would flush, my chest would swell in a way it hadn't since I was in my 20s. I had almost forgotten what it was like to want someone and to feel that they wanted me in return, to feel the kind of electricity that only attention, admiration, and the promise of touch can create. I began to believe again, not just in beauty, but in myself, in the woman I had been, the woman I still was underneath the years. And each day as I dressed and posed and sent my photos, I felt a little more like her, the vibrant, alive, adored woman I thought time had stolen from me. It was thrilling, it was addictive, it was everything I had missed for decades, and I didn't care how old I was. I was young again in a way I hadn't been since my wedding day, trouble offshore. It started with a message that made my chest tighten, not with excitement, but with worry. "I'm in trouble," he wrote. "The machines I'm working with have failed. If I don't fix them quickly, the contract holders can have me arrested. I need help." I froze. My mind raced. How could I help someone I had never met? Someone halfway across the world? And yet the panic in his words stirred something in me. A need to do something to protect him, to be needed again, even after all these years of longing for attention and touch. He asked for $10,000 to repair the machinery, assuring me he would pay me back. He sounded desperate, but also calm, careful, like he was choosing his words to trust me. And for a moment I felt like I was the only person in the world who could save him. I sent the money, and then came the next request, 40,000, then 60,000. Each time I hesitated, but each time his messages wrapped around my loneliness and desire like a velvet glove. He reminded me I was beautiful, that I deserved love, that he would come to me once his problems were solved, and finally make me feel like the woman I longed to be. I didn't see it as fraud. I didn't question it. My heart had been starving for decades, and finally someone was paying attention. Someone was validating me in the way I had longed for. I told myself that helping him was an act of love, that this money was just a bridge to the touch and praise I had been denied for 20 years. It felt dangerous, but it also felt like life again. For the first time in decades, I was wanted. I couldn't see that desire was clouding my judgment. I couldn't see that my loneliness had made me vulnerable in ways I had never imagined. All I knew was that for the first time in years, my heart was beating faster than my fear, and that feeling was intoxicating, crossing the line. It started with tens of thousands, then hundreds, then 500,000. I don't even want to think about the exact number because my shame still sits heavy in my chest. Each request came wrapped in urgency, machines failing, contracts in jeopardy, threats of arrest, and each time I felt needed, I told myself I was helping a man in trouble, a man who promised to see me, to hold me, to make me feel alive again. Every dollar I sent was a step closer to that moment. Warnings came, of course. My bank manager said it could be fraud. Friends hinted subtly, but I refused to believe it. He wouldn't do this to me, not after everything we've shared. The loneliness, the years of invisibility, the hunger for touch, it blinded me. I couldn't see the danger right in front of me. Even when I changed banks to continue sending him money, I didn't stop. I rationalized it as necessary, as temporary. I didn't want to admit I was being manipulated. I wanted to be seen, to be desired, to feel the thrill of attention I hadn't known in decades. Every photo I sent, every compliment he returned, tightened the hold he had over me. He made me believe that my beauty, my worth, my very life was intertwined with him. I believed I could give, and in return, I would receive the validation I had been starving for my entire adult life. I was crossing lines I never imagined crossing. My pride, my savings, my caution, everything. But I couldn't stop. It wasn't until weeks later, when the silence hit, that I realized how deep I had fallen. The thrill vanished, leaving only the echo of my own desperation. And in that emptiness, I began to understand the truth I had refused to see. But understanding alone couldn't undo the years of longing I had so willingly given to a stranger. The awakening when he blocked me, it felt like a punch to the chest. All the messages, all the praise, all the promises, they vanished in an instant. My inbox empty, my phone silent. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, unable to breathe, unable to think. I couldn't believe it. How could someone I trusted, someone I had given so much to, simply disappear? Then reality struck, the warnings I had ignored, the bank manager who had pleaded with me, my husband who had tried to intervene, all of them had been right. I had been deceived, betrayed by a stranger whose words had preyed on my deepest vulnerabilities. I felt ashamed, humiliated, foolish. I thought about all the money I had sent, over $500,000 gone. And worse, I thought about what I had sacrificed emotionally, years of patience, loyalty, my own peace of mind. But beneath the shame, something else stirred, a quiet, trembling recognition. I had been longing for touch, for love, for admiration, not money, not lies. I had been seeking something my marriage had stopped giving me decades ago. I had been starved, and I had acted out of hunger. When I finally told my husband, I expected anger. I expected scolding. I expected disappointment. But what I saw instead was understanding, gentle, patient, unwavering. "I'm just glad you're safe," he said, holding my hands. "We'll figure this together." And in that moment, I realized something else. My desire to be seen, to be touched, to feel alive again wasn't wrong. What had been wrong was allowing that longing to blind me to reality. It was a painful awakening, but it was also a beginning, a chance to reclaim what I had lost, to remember that love could still exist in the place where it had quietly waited for me all these years. For the first time in decades, I understood that the desire to feel alive again could be honored safely with someone who truly cared for me, and I was ready to try. Love renewed after the shock faded, after the anger, the shame, and the tears, something extraordinary began to happen. My husband and I started talking not just about bills or schedules or the ordinary rhythms of life, but about us, about what had changed, what we had lost, and what we still wanted. For the first time in decades, we spoke openly about desire, about touch, about admiration, about the quiet hunger that had grown between us like an unspoken secret. It wasn't easy. There were awkward moments, old wounds reopening, vulnerabilities exposed. But with each conversation, each admission, we peeled away the years of silence and neglect. I told him what I had needed, what I had longed for, and he listened, truly listened, and then slowly it returned. The touches, gentle at first, exploratory, rediscovering what we had forgotten about each other, a hand on my back, a kiss on my forehead, a lingering hug that left both of us breathless, the admiration, compliments that weren't rehearsed, that weren't coaxed, that came from a place of genuine love and renewed desire. We laughed together again, teasing each other like we used to. We held hands in public, sat close at dinner, and made a quiet pact to never let time silence us the way it had before. For the first time in years, I felt seen not by a stranger on the internet, not by anyone else in the world, but by the man who had stood beside me all these decades, the man I had chosen, the man who had chosen me. I realized something vital. The love I had sought elsewhere was never truly gone. It had been waiting for us to wake up, to speak, to remember, and now awakened it was stronger, richer, and more tender than it had ever been. I was still beautiful, yes, but more importantly, I was loved, and I had learned that even after decades of silence, love could be renewed. For the first time in a long time, I felt complete again. And this time I wasn't going to let it slip away. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share it with your friends and subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this one. Your support helps bring more stories to life.